What's up, Reaction Gang? Welcome back to the channel. Yo, up next, we got Thomas Sowell. You know what time it is. Let's get it.
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved.
Wow, see, that said it because they were vulnerable. Means the weak ones, pretty much people that couldn't defend themselves. And it's funny because somebody asked me, I forget what Thomas Sowell video it was, but they asked me how come we wasn't how come we wasn't taught this in school. I was like, I don't know. We was never taught about the in-depths about slavery, how it all started, who we were sold by, who bought us, the different tribes that guarded the African slaves and sold them. We were never, they never went that deep into it. All I remember watching was the movie Roots. That was it. They never went that deep into it. I don't know, maybe they thought it might offend some people. I don't know, but it's history. You know what I'm saying? You can't hide and run from history, something that's already happened. You can't change it. So I'm now learning about a lot of this in my 30s, and that's scary. So I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people out there that's probably older than me and have no idea how all this all started. That's crazy.
Enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern
What? Yeah.
Before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. At least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading.
That's what somebody was telling me too. That even after they tried to abolish slavery, the Africans were still continuing slavery until the British had to get full control of it, to demolish everything. Imagine somebody else had to intervene to stop our ancestors from being enslaved. Wow. Talk about being unappreciative.
Slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million. The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by." This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making. Despite the impression created by Roots during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, A white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors, and the Nyoro and Hima of Ankole enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda, the Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba, and the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners. Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts. An estimated...
Wow. See that part right there? Like a little further up in other parts, I heard on another video of Thomas Sowell. This part right here, I had never heard that before. So they said 10 black slave owners that will tear apart historical perception. So then all they always say like the white slave owners, so those also the black slave owners. And wait, what part did they say that again? I gotta take it back.
Families. There were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts.
Wow.
An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners
What? No, somebody got to fact check that for me in the comments. No way. No way. In Georgia? You can see Georgia for years that went past was known to be like a beautiful state, barely any type of violence. Now, man, you don't have to change a flat tire in Georgia. It doesn't have to be night, daytime. No, sun parts, no. It's that bad right now. But this right here, I never heard that.
Color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were
Wasn't that the Civil War? I forget how many people died, but I said that there was more people died in the Civil War than actual slaves itself. I think that's what I heard. You guys fact check that in the comments for me. I'm gonna double check after I finish with this. But that's what I heard. That's what like the Civil War. A lot of people died, and that was people trying to abolish slavery.
were two major processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation-states with their own armies and navies, raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came. Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, Sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved.
Oh man, there you have it, guys. Some of this stuff I gotta fact check you guys saw my reaction. I was shocked. Some of this I gotta fact check. Some of this because I had no idea. Like I want to say Georgia and New Orleans. Wow, I gotta fact. Unless you guys could fact check it for your boy, or drop the link in the comments. I will be in the comments. But I have stuff like this. This should be taught in school. This shouldn't be beaten around and sugarcoating it down. Stuff like this. This is history. This is a big part of history that a lot of people need to know, because people still run around blaming the white man for everything, and I mean everything for everything. But I will see you guys next video. Give me you guys take on this in the comments. I will be in the comments. Until then, I'll catch you guys next video. Peace out. Have a blessed day.